Kingdom of Kandy was an independent monarchy of the island of Lanka, located in the central and eastern portion of the island. It was founded in the late 15th century and endured until the early 19th century. Initially a client kingdom of the Kingdom of Kotte, Kandy gradually established itself as an independent force during the tumultuous 16th and 17th centuries, allying at various times with the Jaffna Kingdom, the Madurai Nayak dynasty of South India, Sitawaka, the Portuguese and the Dutch to ensure its survival. For the 1590s, it was the sole independent native polity on the island of Sri Lanka, and through a combination of hit-and-run tactics and diplomacy kept European colonial forces at bay, before finally succumbing to final British colonial rule in 1818. The kingdom was absorbed into the British Empire as a protectorate following the Kandian Convention of 1815, and definitively lost its autonomy following the UVA Rebellion of 1817. Name. Over the years, the Kingdom of Kandy has been known by many names. These include Kandy Pasrata, the Senkardigala Kingdom, the Kanda Sudarata, the Mahanuwara Kingdom, Sri Wardanapura, Sinhala, Toon Sinhala Tri Sinhala. Geography and climate. Much of the Kandy Kingdom's territory was located in Sri Lanka's mountainous and thickly forested interior, with mountain passes to the capital providing plenty of opportunities for defenders to stage ambushes. Routes to the city were kept secret, and spreading information concerning them could often result in death. Many routes into the hill country became impassable during the annual monsoon, and malaria was rife. Throughout its existence, Kandian forces used the land to their advantage, engaging in guerrilla warfare against invading forces, and evacuating major urban centers when enemy forces drew near, a tactic used with particular effect during the Kandian Wars. Though the kingdom had intermittent access to the port of Batticaloa, it had no naval forces and could not prevent the Portuguese and Dutch maintaining a strong presence in lowland areas. History. Foundation. The city of Senkardigala may have been founded as early as the mid-14th century during the reign of Vikramabahu III of Gampola. Central Sri Lanka was ruled by the kings of Kotte from the early 15th to late 16th centuries, with Kotte's weakening in the face of Portuguese influence. The area developed into an autonomous domain with Senkardigala at its capital, following the spoiling of Vijayabahu in 1521, and the subsequent partition of the Kingdom of Kotte. Kandy asserted its independence and emerged as a serious rival to the eastern and southern kingdoms. Rise. 1521 to 1594. Following the spoiling of Vijayabahu in 1521, the Kingdom of Kotte split into three competing states: Sitawaka, Ragama, and Bhuvanikabahu VII's Kingdom of Kotte. Of these, Sitawaka, under the dynamic leadership of Mayadan, posed the greatest threat to the autonomy of the other states. In 1522, the Kandians secured Portuguese protection against Sitawaka, but any potential for alliance ended in 1546 when Portuguese and Kotte forces invaded the kingdom. Kandy subsequently lent aid to the Jaffna Kingdom against the Portuguese in 1560. Kandy territory was invaded twice in the 1570s and 1580s, first in 1574, and then in 1581 by the newly crowned king of Sitawaka, Rajasena, who had already scored a significant victory over the Portuguese at the Battle of Mullariawa, succeeded in annexing the kingdom outright. The Kandian king Karaliyad Kumra Bandara fled north to the Jaffna Kingdom with his daughter, Kusumasana Devi, and his son-in-law, Jamasinghe Bandara. Both eventually fell under Portuguese worship, converted to Christianity, and adopted the names Dona Catarina and Dom Philip respectively. In the meanwhile, the Portuguese also laid claim to the Kandian realm, citing Dharmapala's donation of 1580 as a precedent. Sitawakan rule over Kandy proved difficult to enforce. Sundara Madayans, Rajas in as viceroy in the area, rebelled soon after the initial conquest, though his uprising was crushed. Another occurred in 1588. Resistance eventually coalesced around Konapu Bandara, son of Sundara, who had fled to Portuguese lands following his father's murder by agents of Raja Xenia. Between 1591 and 1594, he returned to the area, seized the Kandian throne under the name Vimaladamasurya and married Dona Catarina. Victories over the Sitawakans and the Portuguese secured his position. The strategic situation in Sri Lanka changed dramatically during Vimaladamasurya's rise to power. To the north, the Portuguese deposed the King Pavarajapandaram of the Jaffna Kingdom in 1591 and installed his son Adhiramana Singham as client king. In 1594, Raja Xenia died and the kingdom of Sitawaka disintegrated. Kandy remained the sole native polity outside of European dominance. In 1595, Vimaladamasurya brought the sacred tooth relic, the traditional symbol of royal and religious authority amongst the Sinhalese, to Kandy, and Kandy entered a long period of attritionary warfare with the Portuguese, starting with the campaign of Dancha, consolidation and interactions with the Dutch. Hostilities between the Portuguese and the Kandians continued throughout the rest of Vimaladamasurya's reign. The Kandians lent aid to a rebellion led by Domingos Correa and later Simao Correa, Sinhala subjects of Dharmapala, between 1594 and 1596. A Portuguese incursion in 1604 saw them capture Balin, but dissent amongst the Lascarin troops forced a withdrawal back to the coast. Relations between the Dutch Republic and the Kandians were initiated on the 2nd of June 1602 when Dutch explorer Joris van Spilbergen arrived at Santhamuradu on the eastern coast of Sri Lanka. Later that year, the Dutch East India Company dispatched Sabuldaweer to Kandy in an attempt to negotiate a treaty. The visit ended in disaster when the visitors offended the Kandian hosts with their behavior, and in the ensuing fracas Daweer and several of his entourage were killed. Vimaladamasurya died in 1604. The throne passed to his cousin, Senara, who at the time of the king's death was an ordained priest, but left the Sangha and married Dona Catarina. In 1611, Portuguese forces captured Kandy in the name of the pretender Mayadun of Uva and torched the city yet again. In 1619, Kankili II was deposed and the Jaffna Kingdom absorbed into the Portuguese Empire. Despite these setbacks, Senara survived as king and in 1612 had even concluded a treaty with the VOC. When help came, it was in the form of a Danish East India Company fleet which arrived in 1620, but failed to secure Trincomalee and was expelled by the Portuguese. The Portuguese strengthened the position throughout the 1620s, building forts at Kalutara, Trincomalee, Batticaloa, and in Sabaragamuwa, and upgrading fortifications in Colombo, Gaul, and Manicardwara. A disastrous defeat at the Battle of Randaniwel on the 2nd of August 1630, in which Portuguese Captain General Constantino de Sá de Noronha killed, resulted in large parts of Portuguese Silao being overrun by the Kandians. Internal instability yet again prevented the Kandians from securing their acquisitions, and by the time of Senarat's death in 1635, lowland Sri Lanka was once again again under Portuguese control. The throne now passed to Senarat's son Rajasinya II, who led the Kandians to a major victory over the Portuguese at Madurai on 28 March 1638. The battle was to be the last major military victory for the Kingdom of Kotte, and succeeded in severely weakening the Portuguese presence in Sri Lanka. In May of that year he concluded a wide-ranging alliance with the Dutch, who were by now in control of Batavia. Batticaloa and Trincomalee fell in 1639, Gaul in 1640, and Kandian forces seized Portuguese territories further inland. Relations between the Dutch and the Kandians had been difficult from the onset, and the alliance fell apart in the 1640s. The two sides joined forces again in the 1650s to expel the Portuguese, but a final break occurred in 1656 in the aftermath of the fall of Colombo after a 6-month siege and the final expulsion of the Portuguese from Sri Lanka. Rajsimha demanded that the fort be handed over to the Kandians for demolition in November. The Dutch refused and drove the king and his army from the vicinity. Rajsimha's hold over his own population was tenuous, and rebellions against him in 1664 and 1671 gave the Dutch the opportunity to seize large parts of Sabaragamuwa in 1665, as well as Kalpetia, Kotte, Batticaloa and Trincomalee. The seizure of the ports was a serious blow to the Kandian Kingdom. Not only were Dutch holdings now more or less contiguous with the territory the Portuguese had held, but all Kandian trade was now in Dutch hands. Rajasinya attempted to negotiate an alliance with French, who seized Trincomalee, but were expelled by the Dutch in 1672. Kandian campaigns in 1675 and 1684 recaptured some territory, but by the time of Rajasinha's death in 1687 neither city had returned to Kandian control. Rajasinha's son ascended to the throne as Vimaladharmasuri II, and his 20-year reign proved relatively peaceable. A trade war broke out in 1701, when the Kandians closed the borders with Dutch territories in order to stimulate trade through the ports of Puttalam and Kotte. As a result, the Dutch lost control of the areca nut trade and retaliated. By 1707 Kandian borders had reopened and both ports were closed. Upon his death Vimaladharmasuri was succeeded by his son, who ruled as Vira Narendra Sinha. Several anti-Dutch uprisings occurred in the lowlands during the course of the 1720s and 1730s. The Kandians in turn declared war in the Dutch in 1736 and seized some territory. Hostilities subsided with the appointment of Gustaaf Willem van Imhoff as governor, and by 1737 the Dutch and Kandians were once again at peace. The Nayakas and the coming of the British. 1739 to 1803 A succession crisis emerged upon Narendra Sinha's death in 1739. The king had one son, Anambudve Bandara, by a Sinhala consort. However, succession to the Kandian throne was reserved exclusively for those of Kshatriya ancestry on both the mother and father's side, and Anambudve's mother had been of a lower caste. With the support of the Bhikkhu Weliwita Sarankara, the crown passed to the brother of one of Narendra Sinha's senior wives, a member of the Telugu-speaking and Tamil-speaking Nayak house from southern India. He was crowned Sri Vijaya Rajasinya later that year. Relations between the Sinhala populace, including the Kandian aristocracy, and the Nayakas remained fraught throughout the 18th and early 19th centuries. As early as Narendra Sinha's reign, attempts at appointing Nayakas to prominent positions in court had caused rebellion, including one in 1732 that the king had only been able to crush with Dutch assistance. The Nayaka nobility, which tended to be exclusivist and monopolize access to the king, was seen as forming an elite group. privileged above the native aristocracy, the powerful Adigas. Though Srivijayarajasingha's reign proved relatively peaceful, his successor Kirti Sri Rajasingha had to deal with two major rebellions. The first, in 1749, was directed at his father Naranappa. The second, in 1760, was a far more dangerous insurrection which attempted to replace him with a Siamese prince. Despite these tensions, however, the Nayaka dynasty endured, establishing support by the patronage of Buddhism and Kandian culture. Throughout the reigns of Srivijayarajasingha and Kirti Sri Rajasingha, the Kandians launched numerous raids and incursions into Dutch territory, including the annexation of villages in 1741, 1743, and 1745. The Dutch governors, subservient to Batavia, were under strict orders to avoid conflict with the kingdom, without ceding any of the privileges, including monopoly of the cinnamon trade. In 1761, however, Kirti Sri Rajasingha launched a major invasion of the Low Country, annexing Matara and Hanwela as well as numerous frontier districts. It was to prove to be a disaster. The Dutch recaptured Matara and Hanwela in 1762, seized Puttalam and Chilaw in 1763, and then drove inland in a two-pronged invasion. The Kandians evacuated Senkadagala, which the Dutch torched. Outlying agricultural lands were also ravaged, leaving the kingdom on the brink of starvation by 1764. Kirti Sri Rajasingha requested assistance from the British in 1762, but failed to secure an alliance. By 1765 the Dutch were in a position to force a treaty upon the Kandians, returning not only the border districts but all of Kandy's coastal provinces to the Dutch. Henceforth, the kingdom would be effectively cut off from the outside world. Relations between the Dutch and the Kandians remained peaceable after this until the final expulsion of the former from the island in 1796, though several British sailors and priests had landed in Sri Lanka as early as the 1590s. The most famous was Robert Knox, who published an historical relation of the island Ceylon based on his experiences during the reign of Rajasingha II in 1681. 100 years later, British involvement in Sri Lankan affairs commenced in earnest with the seizure of Trincomalee by Admiral Edward Hughes as part of general British-Dutch hostilities during the American War of Independence. The tumult of the French Revolution had spread to the Netherlands by 1795, and Dutch Zeeland sided with the Batavian Republic during the ensuing conflict. The British rapidly annexed Dutch possessions in Sri Lanka, taking Trincomalee between 28 and 31 August, particular on 18 September, and the entirety of Jaffna on 28 September. Magastendasawa, the Kandian ambassador, negotiated the treaty in Madras, securing the return of much of the eastern coast to the Kandians in February 1796. By the 15th of that month, Colombo had fallen and Dutch rule on the island had come to an end. Kirti Sri Rajasingha died in the midst of these events in January 1796, and was succeeded by his brother Sri Rajasingha. The new king rejected the terms of Magasten's treaty, depriving the kingdom of the opportunity to regain the lands it had lost a generation earlier. It proved to be a fateful decision. The British immediately set about organizing the new acquisitions, establishing systems of government, education, and justice, with the appointment of Frederick North as the first British governor of Ceylon. Any hope of the Kandians regaining their eastern territories essentially disappeared. Sri Rajasingha died of illness on 26 July 1798 with no heir. The English East India Company and the Crown both had control over the island from 1798 until it became the British Crown colony of Ceylon in 1802. Much of the king's reign had been dominated by the powerful First Minister, Pili Metalor, who now moved to enthrone a young relative of the king, 18-year-old Konasami, as Srivikrama Rajasena. Muthuswami, brother-in-law of Sri Rajadi Rajasena, also claimed the throne of Kandy, but Pili Metalor arrested him and his sisters. The First Minister was close to the British, however could not control Srivikrama Rajasena. He coveted the throne for himself, and at meetings with the British at Avasarwala between 1799 and 1801 requested British assistance in deposing Srivikrama Rajasena. Complex negotiations ensued, with various ideas, including the king being moved to British lands with Pili Metalor acting as his viceroy in Kandy, were discussed and rejected by both sides. The territories still possessed by the Dutch on the island were formally ceded to the British in the 1802 Treaty of Amiens, but the English company still retained a monopoly on the colony's trade. Agents of the British were put in charge of lucrative pearl fisheries, cotton plantations, salt and tobacco monopolies. In the first 3 years the government received £396,000 from pearl fisheries. This compensated for the lower price of cinnamon because of Dutch stocks in Amsterdam. Amidst rising tension, matters came to a head when a group of Moorish British subjects were detained and beaten by agents of Pili Metalor's. British demands for reparations were ignored by the Kandians, and Sir North ordered a British force to invade Kandian lands, starting the First Kandian War. On the 31st of January 1803, a British force led by General Madurai marched to Kandy and found it evacuated. The British force installed Muthuswami, but he was not respected by the Kandians. The British were surrounded by hostile people, lacked food, and suffered disease. Madurai became ill and put Major Davy in charge. The British abandoned Kandy, with the sick left behind were put to death. Kandian forces defeated the retreating British at the Mathavali River, executing Muthuswami and all the British prisoners except Davy and 3 others. This Kandian War lasted for 2 years, becoming the longest and most intensive period of the Kandian Wars, because Governor North continued to send forces to the frontiers. Annexation and rebellion. 1803 to 1817, the British fought their way to Kandy, encountering Kandian resistance led in part by a Malay commander known as Sangunglo. Upon their arrival they found the city deserted. Rather than torching it, they installed a puppet king, Muthuswami, and left a small garrison in the town before withdrawing. The Kandians recaptured the city, leaving only one survivor, and harried British forces down to the Mathavali River, but were routed at Hanwela. The following year another British incursion resulted in stalemate, and an uneasy truce was in place by 1805. In the following decade, Sri Vikrama Rajasena's increasingly erratic and capricious rule led to serious unrest amongst the population. A major rebellion in the Seven Kerals nearly dethroned him in 1808. The powerful Pili Metalor rebelled in 1810, was captured, and executed. In 1814, the king ordered Ayelepila Adigawa, Dasava of Sabaragamuwa, to Kandy. Ayelepila, suspecting a trap, refused. In revenge, the king had his wife and 3 children executed. Such was the cruelty of the execution that the Kandian populace, not unused to sites of public execution, now turned en masse against the king. The king was also hugely unpopular amongst the clergy for his sudden and brutal seizures of the land and valuables. In November 1814, 10 British subjects were captured and mutilated in Kandian territory. Governor Robert Brownrigg ordered several British forces moved inland from the coastal strongholds in January 1815. accompanied by native forces under Alepila. Molagada, Ahelipola's successor in Sabaragamuwa and Desava of the Four Corrals, defected to the British in February. Kandy was seized on the 14th of February, and Sri Wickramarajah Singha himself captured on the 18th of February by Ahelipola's men. The king was subsequently exiled to India, where he died in 1832. His son died childless in 1843, bringing the Nayaka line to an end. On the 2nd of March 1815, British agents, including Robert Brownrigg and John Doyle, met with the nobility of the kingdom and concluded in a conference known as the Kandian Convention. The resulting agreement allowed for the protection of Buddhism and the preservation of local systems of government under the authority of the British governor in Colombo and supervised by British agents in Sabaragamuwa, the Three Corrals, and UVA. In practice, however, local chiefs such as Alepila and Molagada were acutely aware that they were ultimately answerable to the British, and were in practice junior to British military officers who now had free access to the domains. Rebellion broke out in 1817 in Wellassa, spreading rapidly to UVA and Walpane. Kepiti Pola, Desave of UVA, was sent to quash the uprising, but defected and joined the rebels instead. By July, every major Kandian chief except Molagada had joined the rebellion. Several, including Alepila, had already been captured. Molagada, however, ensured the road to Kandy remained open, and on the 30th of October Kepiti Pola was captured. His associate Madugal Adikram was captured on the 1st of November, and thereafter the rebellion collapsed. Both leaders were beheaded on the 26th of November 1817. Viewing the convention as null and void, the British set about breaking the power of the nobility. Though smaller uprisings occurred in 1820, 1823, and 1824, none of them seriously threatened British government of the Highlands. The area of the Central Highlands in which the Kandian Kingdom was situated had the natural protection of rivers, waterways, hills and rocky mountainous terrain. The prominent location of the Kandian Kingdom with its cool climate had greatly contributed to protect the independence of the nation for nearly 3 centuries. Government. King. According to the Kandian administrative system, the king was head of all spheres. He was also known as Lankashwara Thrizinhiladhishwara. It was accepted that the king owned all lands and therefore was known as Bhupati. Even though the king was called Adishwara, he had to rule according to the advice of the Buddhist priests and chieftains. The king had to follow the customs and traditions which were in popular practice at the time. Otherwise the people would rebel against him if he did not. Not obeying these would be detrimental to the power of the king, an example being Vikramarajah Senior, who had to surrender to the British, merely because he ignored the advice of the Buddhist priests and chieftains and did not follow the age-old traditions. The kings of Kandy became the rulers of the whole island with Vimaladharmasuri. The King's Council. Maharadigas persons were appointed to the title and office by the king. These appointees made up the King's Council of Ministers. Only a very few Adigas existed at one given time, and most senior of Adigas was known as the Maha-Adhikama First Adhika, similar to the post of a modern prime minister. There was no time limit for the office holder, as he held the post at the pleasure of the king, which meant throughout his life, if not incurred the displeasure of the king. It was not hereditary, although members of the same family have been appointed. Raid Mahathayas persons were appointed to the title and office by the king. These appointees headed the administration of a large locality known as Karal, which was a division of the province of the kingdom known as a Desava, and as such he would be subordinate to the local Desava. There was no time limit for the officer holder, as he held the post at the pleasure of the king, which meant throughout his life, if not incurred the displeasure of the king. It was not hereditary, although members of the same family have been appointed. Disors persons were appointed to the title and office by the king. These appointees headed the administration of a large province of the kingdom known as a Disava and was the king's personal representative, tax collector in that area. In modern terms, the post was similar to a combination of the post of chief minister and a governor of a province of Sri Lanka. There was no time limit for the officer holder, as he held the post at the pleasure of the king, which meant throughout his life, if not incurred the displeasure of the king. It was not hereditary, although members of the same family have been appointed. Diyawardarananilame was an office of the royal household, charged with safeguarding and carrying out ancient rituals for the sacred relic of the tooth of the Buddha. The Diyawardarananilame has the responsibility of overseeing of all aspects of the Sri Dilada Maligawa. One of his principal duty of organizing the annual pageant, the Kandy Esala Perihira. Basnayakanilame. Law. The Kingdom of Kandy had its own law. Some parts of it have been annexed to the current Sri Lankan law along with common law, Roman Dutch law and the Sualame law.